Okay, friends, I have Steph Barron Hall with me today of Nine Types Co. You might be more familiar with her from there. Welcome, Steph.
Thanks so much for having me.
Of course, we are so excited. I was going to say we're so into the Enneagram, but I feel like everyone is, right?
That's true. That's true.
But I do know that there's still some people that are like, Ennea, what? So I'm really excited to kind of show people who aren't familiar that are always just like, what is this? How can I figure mine out? But then also for the people who do know, but maybe want to learn some more to get some insight. So we just have so much to talk about. So before we kind of dive into specifically the Enneagram, can you tell us about you and Nine Types Co. and all of that good stuff?
Sure. So I am Steph and I love the Enneagram. I always say I talk to people about the Enneagram on the internet. That's like my little tagline because sometimes it's a lot to explain. But so I started Nine Types Co. in 2017. I had a different side hustle and I was like, you know what? I want something new. And so I was like, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to create coffee mugs for each Enneagram type. So that's where I started out.
Oh, wow.
And that's actually where the name came from, because I was like, I don't want something that explicitly says Enneagram in the name. So I'll call it Nine Types Co., which is funny because now people always misread it and they think it says 90 Pesco. The first time I heard that, I was like, oh my, that is not great. But yeah. So at this point I just embraced it, but I really started getting into the Enneagram maybe 5 years ago, maybe a little more than 5 years ago, and just was like fascinated by it. And so I thought, I'd love to work with teams with the Enneagram and organizations. And that kind of propelled me to go back to school and get my master's. So I have a master's degree in organizational communication and leadership. And so I kind of fused that with my Enneagram certifications in order to really serve teams and individuals both. So that's kind of a little bit about my background. And Nine Types Co. pivoted from being about coffee mugs and selling a product to being more about service and really education. I think that's the thing that I really love about the Enneagram, is that there's so much to learn and there's so much depth. And so I just enjoy sharing that.
That's awesome. And you have a book, correct?
Yep. It's called The Enneagram in Love. And it's basically about interpersonal communication. So really it is focused on romantic partnerships, but any partnership could probably benefit from it.
Yeah, for sure. That is so neat. It is mind blowing once you have yours figured out and then you start to learn about your partners and you're just like, so that's why you do
that. Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So what is the Enneagram?
Yeah. So the Enneagram is a motivation-based personality framework oriented around 9 core motivations or 9 archetypes. And so what that means is that it's really about what's underneath the surface. It's not really about behavior. It's not like, oh, you're a perfectionist, or, oh, you're always late, or you're on time, or you're organized. It's not about those things. It's really about why you do what you do. And so when I say Enneagram, I'm really saying Ennea, which means 9, and then gram, which means something written or drawn. And so I'm just referring to the symbol itself. And there's like a lot of symbolism within that. But yeah, so that's kind of the basics of the Enneagram. And it's really intended to be used for growth. And so spiritual growth or psychological growth or, emotional health and self-awareness, things like that. So one of the challenges about the Enneagram is that it focuses on some of the less desirable aspects of your personality type, right? So it looks at kind of your shadows and your blind spots and helps you to understand them and kind of understand how to move forward from there.
Oh, yes. I love that. It's such a great tool. I feel like sometimes I would get a little defensive and be like, this is boxing me in, or like, I am not the stereotype of my number. But like when you see it as a tool and not as, a box or you, then I heard someone once say that it's like a color scale, like you don't have to, you're not just like there, that's you. So It's so helpful. So before we dive into each type, which there are 9 types, like Steph had said, how can someone listening who isn't familiar with the Enneagram find out their number? Obviously, we'll walk through each one. So maybe they'll get an idea like, oh, that sounds like me. But if they want to explore it further, what should they do?
So I don't always love the online tests, mostly because they're not always very accurate. So a really easy way to approach it is to take a quiz or a test online. That's fine. And then you can just look at your top 2 to 3 results, maybe 4 results, especially if some of them are tied, and then read a little bit further about those. So don't think, oh, I took the test and it says I'm a 2, and now I took a test and it says I'm a 9. And so my type changed. Your type doesn't change. It's just, but your test results can, based on a lot of different factors, what test you're taking and where you are in life and how you're doing that day and all those different things. So tests are typically pretty good at measuring behavior, but they're not as good at measuring motivation, like why you're doing what you're doing. So that's why I kind of focus on that. So read a little bit more about the types that came up to the top for you. And, you can go in your podcast app and type in Enneagram 4 and probably find a bunch of people who have shared about their experiences in Enneagram 4 and see what it's like to be inside their head. And that can be really, really helpful. There are also a lot of places to read online. And I also have included in my Instagram a typing guide that will help you kind of peruse the different types and understand how to think about them. But yeah, it's kind of a journey. It's not like straightforward. It's not like you just punch in your birth date and then it shows up for you. So that's a bit of a challenge about it, but I think it's really worth it to figure it out.
It is. It's so fun once you figure it out. And I agree, like the test, I took the test and it told me I was a 2. And I feel like I know so many women who took the test and it said that they were a 2. And I don't know, one day I'd love to like unpack the psychology of that, like why so many of us test as 2s or something. But yeah, I found personally that just like reading about all of them was like, that's not me. Okay. So I would love to walk through all 9 Enneagram types. You could share with us like just general description and core motivation, like you said. And then since this is a very stressful time, maybe you could share how each type shows up in stress.
Sure. So again, I'll just say it is complex. So you might, if you're listening and you don't know your type, you might resonate with a lot of these. So just keep that in mind that, a lot of us have all of these to an extent, but there is one that's really driving and persistent beneath the surface. So for type 1, they are really motivated by this need to be good. And when I say good, I don't mean like to be good at things. I mean, to be a good person, like in a really deep and sincere way. And that can vary depending on the person, like what actually being a good person means, but they do have that desire. And so they're kind of focused on being right and correct. And they tend to be idealists who believe a perfect world could exist if everyone just did their part, but then they work really hard to make it come to fruition and they fall short. And so they get frustrated. So that's the type 1. But they have a lot of energy to work toward excellence and to work toward raising the bar for themselves and for others. And so they can be really great forces for good in the world, even though deep down, sometimes they are afraid that they're not as good as they think they are. So that's a really hard thing about type 1s. Type 2s are motivated by a need to be loved and wanted and needed. And a lot of the time 2s subconsciously believe that they are most loved or lovable when they're helping others. And so they will help others in whatever way they can. Sometimes it's, bringing somebody a casserole, something like that. But a lot of the time, and that's kind of a stereotype, right? I also don't know any millennials who bring a casserole, but it's such a stereotype, but
it is.
But yeah, they often are more helpful in other ways. It might not always be tangible. It might be relationally helpful or encouraging or asking good questions or listening and kind of giving of themselves for others. And because it feels, one, they genuinely want that relationship and that connection, but they also kind of worry that if they're not that helpful, that other people won't love them or like them. And that's what they really want in the world. And so they're very relational, and they're very connective, and they tend to be very warm. Not all twos want to be helpful all the time, but all twos really want that connection and relationship with other people. And so they can be really fantastic friends and loved ones because they really do care genuinely about the people around them.
Love that.
Yeah. So type threes are motivated by this need to be successful and admired and valued. And what's beneath that for threes is kind of a desire to be worthy. And so they kind of look at their relationships, or they look at their society or their culture or their family values, and they think, okay, what does success mean in this sphere? Mm-hmm. And so then they strive to meet it because they believe that they'll be valued and worthy if they meet that. So a lot of the time, threes are very productive, and they're very much about like output, putting more out into the world. But deep down, they have this fear that they won't meet their full potential, and that will be really devastating, or that they'll fail, and that will be devastating as well. And so to kind of combat that sense of not being enough, threes can, just always do more. And they can be very inspiring and very engaging and charming because they do have a unique way of seeing other people and being able to understand other people's desires or expectations, and then kind of meet them even in a way that's really relational and adaptable as well. So it's not all about work for threes. That can look a lot of different ways, but a lot of the time that's kind of one of the ways that threes are pigeonholed.
Yeah. Wow. This is so interesting. Is all of this rooted, no matter what the type, is it all rooted in like the need for love, or does that depend on the type?
So that depends on the type, but those first three types are kind of, I have a friend actually who makes up triads on Instagram, like make up like a new triad. And if I were to make up a triad, but what I mean by triad is like a grouping of three numbers.
Okay.
And so if I were to make up a triad, I would say that those first three types, they need to ask, what is mine to do? And how can I do more for myself and less for other people? Because those first three types are very much about like, they do it all for everybody, and they're very responsible, and they're very dedicated to meeting other people's needs. And sometimes each of those types can overlook their own real needs.
Wow. I never thought about that, but that is interesting. I never put those three together. Interesting. Okay. Sorry to interrupt in the middle of the.
No, you're fine. That's great. So type fours are motivated by this need to find their true heart and to be really deeply understood by themselves and by others around them. And I know that sounds really woo-woo, but when I say it, I know a lot of fours are like, oh, I really felt that. Yeah. Because there is a need for like that deep introspection and understanding. And I've heard it said that fours, by the time they're like 25, have felt every possible emotion that anyone could ever feel, because they're acutely aware of it. And it's just like the full spectrum of emotional experience.
Wow.
Yeah. And so fours kind of have this, they've gotten this message in their lives that they're either too much or they're not enough. And so they don't want to experience that. They want to be understood. They want to be seen for who they are. And they want this deep meaning and significance in their lives, and really bringing and highlighting the beauty in all things. But when they constantly miss that or constantly can see opportunity for more, they end up feeling sometimes a little bit sad, or a little bit like bummed that things aren't meeting that expectation of what could be, like the beauty and the idealism. But with that, fours can also be really deeply empathetic and understanding of others. And they bring a lot of creativity and interest to the world because they just understand things in such a unique way.
This is like, it's very interesting. I feel like I'm like in the minds of everyone.
Yeah. So type fives are motivated by this need to be competent and self-sufficient. And fives really believe that having enough knowledge is what not only will make them competent, but will make them steady and like will make them kind of feel secure. And so they constantly seek knowledge. They constantly seek more understanding, and to make themselves self-sufficient. There are some types that go out and conquer the world to make themselves autonomous, but fives kind of decrease their needs. So they decrease their expectations of others. They decrease their expectations of the world, and sometimes can live a very like, not stoic. I can't think of the word, but just a life that doesn't need much from the world other than knowledge. It doesn't need much. Right. Because they really don't want to be intruded upon. They don't want to experience the pain of somebody else invading their space and invading their life. And so, yeah, they can tend to self-isolate and really withdraw and have strong boundaries because of that. But also fives can be very kind and generous. Once they allow somebody to get to know them, they really open up and are very committed to having a strong relationship and a very loyal relationship with those around them.
Interesting. I have a question about fives. So is it that I feel like of all the numbers, I feel like fives are the type that I don't know many of. Is that because they're rare, or is it because like they don't really take the test and like, or not take the test, but either take the test or read into which they are and then share about it?
I think it's probably a little of both. I think it's probably that there probably are fewer fives. I think there are also a lot of fives. They might get into the Enneagram like that. That's common, but they get into it in such a way that they're not going out and talking about it. It's more like they're reading all the books and they're really researching and they're finding the best expert they can find and dissecting it from that perspective. And so it's much more academic in some ways, or it could be a lot more spiritual where they're really going the mystic route with it. But I think that's a big difference. And I think in general, fives just don't tend to self-disclose as much unless they're super close with people. So that's common as well.
Interesting.
Yeah. So type sixes are motivated by this need to be secure and in community, and they really long for safety. And sometimes we think, oh, sixes always know where the fire extinguishers are, which might be true. There are sixes who are like that, but a lot of the time sixes are really thinking about threats in their environment. And that typically means more so about financial threats or plans that are happening and making sure that they can troubleshoot them. So it's not that they're always afraid or that they're always anxious. It's just that they're very aware of what's going on around them and how they can mitigate anything negative that might happen so that they can feel calm and feel kind of safe from that. And so they do get the reputation for being a little bit overly anxious, but they're also really great at like troubleshooting and figuring out what could happen and then making sure that it doesn't, essentially. And they're also really great at like building friendships and connections. They really long for a deep community with other people, and they want connection with other people, and they want to have friendships and alliances that make them feel supported and safe, and that where they can also reciprocate that as well. They're very practically minded and responsible and dutiful people.
Nice. I'm a six, and I always feel like I hate, probably everyone feels this way about their type, but I always hate the six stereotype, like that. I'm just that, they're always scared or and I'm like, I am prepared, people.
Right. You're aware, you're alert.
Yeah.
Well, and that actually is the thing with sixes too, that this is kind of in the weeds, but there's this thing called subtypes, which basically is that within each type, there are 3 subtypes and they're pretty distinct. And with 6 in particular, they're very distinct. And so the different subtypes show up very differently. And so it's very, very difficult to describe the type 6 without describing the subtypes. And so that's why you kind of end up with those generalizations. They're like, oh, they're just anxious, because it's very difficult to describe all 6s with one. Same thing is true with 4s, actually. With one description, it's very difficult to describe all of them.
Interesting. That makes sense. Cause there's definitely 6s that I'm like, I don't relate to you at all, but I feel like my 7 wing is so strong that like, if someone has a 5 wing, I'm just like, no. But I haven't looked into the subtypes, so maybe that would kind of make more sense. Since I brought up
Yeah.
wings and didn't explain it, do you mind explaining wings for people that are like, what?
Sure. So wings are, and you probably have seen wings and not known what that meant. You might see like a little 6 with a small W in the center and then 7. So that signifies 6 wing 7. And so your wing type is a type adjacent to your core type that kind of modifies your behavior. So it kind of dictates how your core type is lived out. So your core type, like I've said, is about core motivation. Like what is your why? What's underneath? It's that persistent driving force. And your wings kind of bring balance. I've heard it said that the core type is the tension between the two types on either side. And as you have been listening to this, you might have been noticing that like, wow, it seems like the types that are next to each other are super opposite, which is true a lot of the time. And so they do bring balance. They bring, they kind of mitigate some of the strength of the types in a sense. So my approach to wings is that, one, I don't think they matter a ton. I think subtypes typically matter more, but some people find wings to be super helpful. And they are really, you can have one strong wing. So you might really resonate with the type 7 if you're a 6, or you could have both. So you might sometimes resonate strongly with 7 and sometimes with 5, or neither wing. So it can be any of the above, but it does sometimes explain why the types are a little bit different, especially, within the type. I think subtypes explain that in more detail, but wings can also be helpful. And then how do you find your wing is basically that you just look at the types on either side of you. So it's not like you look at your test and then your top result is your core type and your second result is your second type. That's not how it works, or your wing type. People always do that. And then they come up with, I'm a 3 wing 8. And I'm like,
yeah,
well, that's not actually possible. So like, let's rethink about this.
yeah.
So it has to be attached. Like it's like a chicken wing. It has to be attached. So, I mean, I realize that once you eat chicken wings, they're not attached, but like wings are attached to birds. You know what I mean? So yeah, that's important to know. So yeah, that's wings.
That's perfect.
Super, super quick.
Yeah.
So type 7s are motivated by this need to be free to explore every possibility and opportunity. So they sometimes get their reputation for being really fun and enthusiastic and kind of out there and off the wall because it's like they're constantly in brainstorming mode. They are very cerebral, which is something that people often miss about 7s. We think of 5s as the most cerebral types, and then 6s, and then 7s, but actually 7s are very cerebral as well. They just express it differently. And so they kind of go through life just wanting to sample everything. They want to try everything possible. And sometimes they don't even realize that they're exhausting themselves or burning themselves out by trying to sample every possible thing along the way. So 7s kind of have this desire to run into the future so that they can taste more of the world. And also so that some of the challenges or difficulties of the present won't loom as large in their life. And so 7s who've been through something a bit challenging in life or a bit traumatic might actually seem a lot more grounded because they have learned a little bit more about how to incorporate the full sense of the emotional spectrum. But in general, 7s are visionaries and they're creative and they can be very expressive. They're not always outgoing, but they can be. And they're a lot of fun to be around, and they're always making plans for the next adventure. So that's really fun. Yes.
I feel like everyone knows 7s, right?
Yeah. They're like, oh, that person's such a 7. Right?
Yeah.
So type 8s are motivated by this need to be against. And when I say that, I don't mean that they're just contrarian for contrarian's sake. I mean that they're really pushing back on what is accepted as true in order to find what's not being said. So they're always kind of looking at, how can they look at something differently and kind of push back on social mores and things like that. But 8s also have like this strong desire for self-protection. So they tend to have a really tough outer exterior until you really get to know them, because they don't want anyone to betray them or they don't want anyone to control them. So they really moderate who gets in behind the barrier. And they tend to be really comfortable. They kind of find conflict to be just a fun conversation, and other people sometimes get thrown off by that because they're like, what is happening here? Why are you fighting? And they're like, oh, I'm just having fun. I'm just, playing devil's advocate. I'm taking the other side of the argument. So eights can really get a reputation though for being bossy or controlling or domineering or brash. And I think that's unfortunate because once you get to know them, they're not that way. They tend to be soft and really they care about others, but, eights just don't tend to care. Like if you make a quick assumption about them, they don't feel the need to change your mind. Whereas, for example, types 2 or 3 would really dedicate themselves to saying like, I'm not that way. I'm this way. Eights are like, well, if you're going to assume that I'm a jerk, then I'm just going to move on. So eights are really dynamic and they're very courageous and daring. And I'm very partial to eights. I love eights, especially because they get such a bad rap.
Yes. I was going to say, I feel like eights is another one that like their stereotype makes them seem like, I'm just always like, the eights I know are not like these stereotypes. That I think the whole enjoying debating, some people take that as they like to fight. Like they're just like raging. Yeah. And it's like that's not.
Yeah. Well, and it's also like eights are very grounded in who they are, and they're grounded in general. And so people expect to be able to push them and that they'll kind of move. And when they don't, people are like, whoa, like you're not, I didn't expect that, Yeah. So I think it's especially 8 women are really misunderstood, and that can be a real challenge. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I'm with you. I have a soft spot.
Yeah. So finally, we have type 9s who are motivated by this need to be at peace internally and externally. And part of the theory of the Enneagram, if you see the symbol, it's that the type 9 is at the top. And so they can kind of look down on all the other numbers, not in a superiority way, but in a way of being able to experience, like to feel really like experientially what it's like to be each of the other types. They are like, oh yes, I'm this type. Oh yes, I'm this type. They can like kind of imagine themselves as each of the types. They really feel it strongly, but they really want unity and harmony. So a lot of the time they look for unity with other people through peace or through understanding them or through mediating or through looking for agreement. And they really don't want to be the cause of discord or the cause of disconnection either. And so sometimes they don't speak up as much about their real desires and their real strengths or their real thoughts, because they want to make sure that everyone is heard and they want to be fair and they want to really care for other people and they want to be comfortable, which for 9s does not mean conflict. It means that, they kind of make themselves smaller sometimes so that there's no disconnection. And so it's interesting because 9s, again, are next to 8s and they're next to 1s, but they're so different from those 2 types in the sense that they do really want everyone else to have space. And so they're so used to kind of being a wallflower that they kind of float into the background, but they can be really good at seeing who else is floating into the background and bringing that person to the forefront, because they really do notice people and they're very warm and connective in general.
Yeah. Love that. My mom's a 9, so I have a soft spot for 9s too. And for listeners who are Whimsy Wellness customers, Haley, our founder, is a 9.
Oh, nice.
For a while she was like, I don't know if I'm a 7 or a 9. We like I think she knew in her core that she was a 9, but people kept telling her that she was a 7. And she's like, guys, I'm a 9. But like, is that something that like are 9s sometimes mistyped as 7s, or maybe they appear as 7s?
Well, a couple of things. So there are all these different ways of looking at the Enneagram. And one of the groupings that we put people into is about how they engage with like conflict and, how they relate with others. And so one of those groupings is called positive outlook. So types 2, 7, and 9, all of them basically want to look on the bright side of things. They want to be kind of optimistic. They want to be positive. They really care about that. And so 7s want other people to be happy so that they can feel happy. And so they kind of have that way about them. And then 9s Well, and with sevens, it's like, they don't want to be weighted down by other people's like negative emotions. So that's kind of part of the reason why they look on the bright side.
Mhm.
I know that makes seven sound bad, but it's not bad. It's just, it's a thing that everyone has their things like that they do.
Yeah.
But nines, they want other people to be happy so that everyone is at peace and everyone is calm. And so, and connected. So that's part of it too. But also, like I mentioned, the subtypes earlier, a specific subtype of type 9 frequently mistypes as sevens because generally nines are thought to be like, oh, they just need a nap. But a lot of nines actually aren't that way. And specifically the social subtype of type 9 is they're very active and driven, and they can be like really social and chatty, and they are constantly doing more, and they have 4 or 5 different jobs all the time, and they're seeking belonging and participating in things. And that can seem very sevenish. So I actually know a few social nines who've bridged that gap. Yeah.
Interesting. So interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. So now do we want to dive into like how each type shows up in stress?
Sure.
Okay.
So there are some ways of looking at the Enneagram with stress where there's a specific pattern of stress and growth. And so what I'm talking about today is not using that model. This is actually using, I frequently on my Instagram will just ask people like, what do you think about, like, how do you experience stress? What is that like for you?
Yeah.
And I love that because I love learning from people. Like I love learning straight from a one, how
Right.
they experience it, because instead of it just being imagined from my perspective, which I probably could imagine a lot of it by now, because I've been doing this for a few years, but I just think it's so much more helpful this way.
Yeah,
So
I agree.
So common stress responses for type ones is that they'll often hold even more tightly to their idea of what's right. So they can be very rigid in black and white. And so they'll even hold even more tightly to that. And then when that doesn't really work, they further internalize that frustration that they feel and become really, really self-critical. In general, ones can be very self-critical, but in stress, they can be even more so.
Interesting.
So type twos, when they're stressed, they work even harder to make themselves indispensable to people around them. They really want to make sure that they're not going to get forgotten or replaced in some sense, because that would threaten their lovability or their likability. So they really work harder to make themselves indispensable. And often that's very subconscious. And then when that doesn't work, they start to realize like that their needs have not been met for ages, right? They're like, I've been spending so much time working for everyone else that I haven't done anything for myself. And so they can sometimes get really demanding about getting their needs met from others around them.
Interesting. So is there like a conscious feeling of resentment for twos sometimes, or is it kind of like subconscious? They don't even really know that that's even there.
I think it's typically conscious. I think sometimes it can be subconscious, but typically they know. And they
they know. Interesting.
So type threes, when they're stressed, they tend to make themselves more busy and start new projects all the time. So I'm a type 3. And at the very beginning of the pandemic, I had been working, I had like contracts out for corporate clients. And I had, this other contract that I was working that was like doing social media management, all this different stuff. And everything dried up like overnight at all of my income. And so I was like, oh my gosh, what am I gonna do? And so within 2 weeks, I like built a brand new course and posted it on my website and did a webinar to drum up business for it.
Wow.
And like,
oh my gosh,
it was like, okay, I have to do this. And I just did it. And I started this new thing. But then what happens for threes often is they'll do that. And then when that doesn't work, they just become listless and unmotivated. And they're just like, nothing is happening. Nothing works. And they just like, don't even feel like doing anything, which is very foreign for threes. Though sometimes it's their body saying like, hey, you need to take a break. So yeah, it's okay. Yeah.
Interesting. I feel like, is it common for threes and eights to be mistyped?
It is. And the big difference is that threes are more so about what other people think of them. And that's not always conscious. Again, sometimes it's just, they don't realize that they're performing, but they're definitely focused on that. And 8s are not. That's not like a big top of mind thing. And so 8s really have no problem when other people don't like them. They really have no problem when other people push back on them or anything. And they also don't really have a strong need for validation, which is really different from 3s. And 3s tend to be a little bit more peacekeeping than 8s. They don't really want to ruffle feathers, even though they both tend to be really bold and dynamic. 3s tend to be a little less, like they're a little bit more political, a little bit more diplomatic and coy about things, which is just not something that 8s are really focused on.
Okay.
Typically.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay, cool.
So for type 4s, when they're stressed, they can really give into daydreaming. They kind of have this imagined world in their mind of what could be, and they just kind of start daydreaming about it. And it's like, again, it's just something that they slip into. And it can be really hard for 4s because sometimes the daydream isn't really possible. And that causes a lot of sadness and melancholy and comparison for them. So that's really tough. But then after the daydreaming phase, sometimes they also might get really vindictive toward others who they've been comparing themselves to and haven't been meeting it. So they can kind of want to make other people feel as bad as they feel sometimes. And again, often that's subconscious. Like often it's like, they don't realize that they're doing it, but they really want somebody to see and feel their suffering. And when people don't, it can be really tough.
Yeah. So is that like rooted in wanting to be understood, or what do you think that's kind of like? Yeah.
Yeah. And sometimes some 4s, like typically I wouldn't say 4s are particularly angry people, but at times they can get really angry because they're like, nobody understands me. And I want to be understood and I want to feel mirrored. And when they don't, that can make them really angry. Yeah.
Yeah. Do they understand them, or do sometimes 4s feel like they don't understand them also?
I think that sometimes 4s don't understand themselves to an extent. Like they're like, I don't know why I can't stop feeling all these things. Like that's something that I've heard 4s say, but I wouldn't say that they're like I think 4s are very, when you say, oh, this is your blind spot, they're like, yeah, I know. Yeah. They pretty much are, they so much live in their inner world that they very much understand, what's going on inside, but they don't always know like how to step out of that pattern. Or they don't. A big blind spot for 4s is that they forget that they actually have the power to change the story. They have the power to change the narrative for themselves.
Yeah.
They forget that. And, like, even if they can't change the situation, sometimes they can bring perspective to how they feel about the situation. But that can just be really tough. Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah. Or 4s. So sad.
I know.
I feel for them. Yeah.
I know. We love you, 4s.
I know. One of my favorite our Instagram accounts is Spicy Enneagram 4 memes. And it's like tweets and just, it's so funny. Like, I think that's like when 4s have that space to like be themselves, they're so funny because they have like this really kind of dark sense of humor, or like sense of humor. It's just so funny. But when 5s are stressed, we talked a little bit earlier about how they tend to withdraw, and they tend to isolate even further because they don't want their energy to be depleted. So when they're stressed, they kind of just like shut down and withdraw. And then they also have a tendency to rely solely on logic. So they separate themselves from any feelings that they might have and try to sort things through using only logic, which can help at times, right? Some of us are like, oh, I wish I could do that. But also it doesn't really get them that far, because like life is emotional. And as humans, we are emotional beings, I think. And maybe I just say that as a heart type. I don't know. But so that can be tough for 5s.
Yeah, no, that's so interesting that like fives go to withdrawing and logic with being like sandwiched in between the four and the six.
Yeah. Yeah.
just
Mm-hmm.
just so interesting to me.
Yeah. So I'm interested to get some real-time feedback, what you think about this. But for type sixes, the common stress response is that they tend to double down and plan every little thing to calm themselves. And so they feel extra responsible for every detail. Like it becomes really like a huge concern for them. And when that isn't met, they can kind of feel a little bit lost or get like a little suspicious of other people around them, of like, everyone is out to get me, the world is out to get me, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I definitely I do relate to the being suspicious of people. Like I'll just start to like look for like how you are against me or something. For sure. Yeah. But I will say that like there's nothing about a five that I relate to except for the withdrawing when stressed. Like I definitely, even if I just have so much on my to-do list, which maybe this could be, I guess, 5 or 7, but like I just will not do any of it because it's like it's way too much. So I'm just going to either like withdraw and lay in bed, or like withdraw and go out and do something fun and pretend that I don't have so much to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, counseling for Meg. No, I'm just kidding. But yeah, definitely the skeptical part. So if someone like really goes to that, like being skeptical and, thinking that someone's against them or that kind of thing, how can like we reset? Because that's not only like damaging for ourselves as a 6, but also the relationship, the other person, all that.
Yeah. A lot of the time that really comes from this really strong desire or really strong need to figure it all out. Like you need to be able to see what threats are going to come and then to figure them out beforehand. And so one of the ways to just step out of that can be just to take a break, and not in a way that's like withdrawing, but to take like a really intentional break of being like, I'm going to give myself some time to do this. And then to make some decisions. That can be really, really helpful of saying like, okay, I'm going to make a decision on these 3 things today, and it's going to be done, and I'm not going to revisit it. It's going to be fine.
Yeah.
I know that I'm prepared. I know that I know all the information that I need. And so just kind of having a little bit more clarity about that, because I really do think that looking for who's out to get you has to do with wanting to figure it out and feel safe. So just reminding yourself that you are safe as you are already is helpful.
Yeah, that's so good. And I do feel like I relate to 4s in that. Well, so it was funny that you said that people will like their wings just aren't possible. Like they'll tell you, because when I first read the Enneagram, I'm like, oh, I'm a 6 wing 4. And then I realized like, oh, that's not possible. But I feel like where I do relate to 4s was just what you were saying. Like, I feel like to be validated in my pain, the other person has to understand it. So like, I can't just know like, someone has passed away and it hurts. It's like, you have to understand how bad it hurts. Otherwise, I don't know what, but it's definitely, I feel like I relate to a 4 in that piece of like, I have to get them to understand the pain or the whatever the case may be. Is that kind of common with 6s or 4s or
Well, so like I was mentioning the triadic grouping earlier of the positive outlook, the 4, 6, and 8 are called emotional realness. And so, or reactivity. And so they all are like, they want to have the real emotions out there. They just want everything to be said and to be out in the open. And also they tend to push back on things and question things a lot. And one of the really painful experiences, and I will also say that 4 and 6 is a pretty common mistype for some, okay. But one of the painful experiences a lot of 6s have is that their experiences are invalidated. Like their anxieties and their fears and their worries are constantly invalidated. And so when they're in a time when they really need somebody to hear them and understand their experience, they can be really painful when somebody doesn't, because they're so used to it. They're so used to hearing like, oh, your worries are just silly. Like you're just being anxious. You're just being whatever. And so I think it really gets exacerbated in stress. Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. Can you share, since we shared like the other two, I think, was it 2 triads?
Yeah. So the
what
other
are
one
those
is
called?
This is called, I call it often just the conflict triads.
Okay.
There's like a more technical name for them, but sometimes the technical names are really confusing. So, yeah. So the other one is called, competency, and it's 1, 3, and 5. And it's really this focus on like, if I separate myself from my feelings, if I stay logical, if I focus, then I can figure this out. And so they're kind of like looking at life like a puzzle a lot of the time and trying to problem solve. And so really, especially when they're in conflict with somebody else, but also just in general, they really separate themselves from being swayed by their emotional experiences, which is unfortunate because a lot of the time our emotions have something really valuable to tell us.
Yeah.
Right. But we forget about that. And so we just think, oh, I'm just going to figure this out and I'm going to rely solely on my mind.
Yes.
Yeah.
Just like the flip side, like I feel like I could use a little bit more logic when I get like stressed. So would that be similar for, you said 4, 6, and 8? Do they go more to the like emotional?
Not so much with 8s. But the thing with 8s is that the thing that 4, 6s, and 8s typically need to hear is like, or need to question is like, do I need to say this thing right now? Like it, like, and so all 3 of those types tend to like say the thing without thinking. They're just like, well, I'm just going to say it. Like, I'm going to put it out there. Cause it's very important for all 3 of those types to be very authentic and very honest for different reasons. I think for 4s, authenticity is top of mind, to being true to themselves. And then for 6s and 8s, the authenticity is a lot more about being honest and being direct, because that's how they can gauge if they can trust people or not.
Interesting.
Interesting. So yeah, there's so much theory to the Enneagram. We could literally do this for 5 hours, but we're not going to. So
yeah, I know. Like I keep going down little rabbit holes.
There's so many of those.
There are. Yes. There's just so many questions. So yes, trying to like keep it non-squirrely brain. So are we on 7? I think we're on 7. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah. So when 7s get stressed, their first reaction is typically to be like, oh, it's not so bad. They just reframe it. They reframe it as, oh, it's actually better that it happened this way because blah, 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 so they kind of go down that path. And then they can sometimes really busy themselves to avoid feeling anxious or fearful. Mm-hmm. And that might be like learning a new hobby, or might be going on a trip, or might be, starting a new project, or it could be really retreating inside themselves and maybe going and reading a book, but they just do something that will engage their mind so that they don't have to feel the fear or the stress or the anxiety that might come about otherwise.
Interesting. So cool.
So type 8s are, when they're stressed, they tend to protect themselves and others, like their close people, even more fiercely. So they have even stronger boundaries and stronger barriers, and will go out and fight people if they need to protect. Like when they're stressed, they're like, okay, we are being threatened, and like, we are going to create these barriers. And then they tend to withdraw so that nobody can control them. And that's a really important thing for 8s, is that they do not want anyone to be controlling them ever. So they really push back against that. And that gets a really visceral response from 8s. And so withdrawing in that sense means like, I'm not going to say anything that could later be used against me. I'm just going to keep to myself so that nobody can see this vulnerability of stress and come in. And even sometimes 8s withdraw because they don't want to admit, like they see stress, like being stressed, experiencing stress as weakness. And so they don't want to admit it.
Interesting.
And finally, we have type 9s. So 9s do something a little similar to 7s, which is that they just ignore it. They ignore the stress. They find a silver lining. And then they pay close attention. They get hyper-focused on their own comfort. So they might create a comfy space in their home, might create a comfy space in their mind where they can just retreat to when they're like, and so you'll be in the room with a 9 who's stressed out. And it's like, they're there, but they're not there, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
They just like kind of go into their brain. They might not text their friends back. They might just be like moving toward comfort and kind of turning their brain off to the stress. Is pretty common for 9s.
Yeah. It's so helpful, I think, like not only to understand your own, how you react to stress, your own number, but then like people that you're in relationship with, whether it's friends or your partner or whatever, because it's just like, oh, okay. Like you almost, certain things that maybe like frustrate you, you suddenly have like compassion for.
Yeah.
Almost like I definitely have experienced that with the Enneagram, and that like the more I learn about my loved ones types, the more like compassion I have for things that used to like really annoy me or frustrate me. Oh, okay. Like that's actually sad, or I can hold space for that because that's very similar to like how I do this or whatever.
Yeah.
So it's such a growth tool. Like you said, I know sometimes people will say like, oh, I changed types, and I know you said like, we don't change types. So at what age do you think our type comes up?
Yeah. So the teaching tradition that I have been taught in is that you are born with your type. So it's kind of like confirmation bias. So you might have, anyone who's like read the Enneagram has probably heard about childhood wounds. And I think it's an important distinction that childhood wounds are not like your parents were like, I'm going to do this thing to you to make you a certain personality.
Yeah.
It's more like just the way that we perceived the world.
That is really interesting.
Yeah. So you're born with a type, and then the things that happen in childhood often just confirm it in the sense that like you perceive it in a specific way, and a different type would perceive it in a different way. But you'll even hear people who, you know, their kid is an 8 and they're like, they came out of the womb an 8. So like, you know,
yeah.
And I think you even hear that from parents a lot of the time too, where they're like, oh, I could tell this baby's personality was different from this baby, like when they were in utero, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
And so, yeah, that's the perspective. And then we all have things that we go through in life. There are so many facets to our personality. This is just one of them. I think it's a really important one, but it's not the only one. So for example, for me, there are a lot of things about me that really align with type 9. And there are a lot of things about me that really align with type 7. And those are not wing types for me. So those are just types that I really strongly resonate with and kind of experience them in a sense, but like I'm a type 3 and I know that, you know? And so we have all 9 types within us, and really the growth path, like the ultimate growth path, is to be equally all 9 types. And that doesn't mean you shift types. It means like you are very balanced. Like your personality isn't driving you. And so, yeah, I know it's very, very, mystical and interesting to explain.
No, it's so neat. And it's like kind of a relief. I have a baby and I'm always like, I wonder what type we're making him. So it's like,
you're not,
it's reassuring that he's just a type.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Cause it's like, they all have a wound. So I was like thinking about it like, oh great. Which wound am I giving him? So it's reassuring that we're not.
I hear that all the time. And it's just so hard for parents to hear that, because you don't want to do that. And I think most parents do their very best and are well-intentioned. And then some of us turn out with trauma and some of us don't. And that's just how it is. But we all have things in life and ways that we understood the world that, you know, impact us later on. But yeah, it's not intentional.
Yeah. So with each type that has this wounding childhood message, sometimes people will like see that for their type. And for listeners that are like, what is it? It's pretty easy to just Google. I can send you 9. A link. Oh, perfect.
We can put it in the show notes. Yeah.
Oh, perfect. So I think sometimes people are like, well, my parents didn't say that to me. Like I had great parents. I had a great childhood. So that can't be, but like, I just wanted you to reiterate that, like, your parents didn't have to necessarily say that message to you, correct?
Yeah. Yeah. It's typically like what you absorbed from your environment and from the world around you. Like, for example, for type 3, it's like, you're not allowed to have your own identity is the message that was absorbed. Nobody is walking around saying you can't have your own identity. Right.
Yeah.
But that is the message absorbed from the world and from people around you and everything. And a different kid in the same scenario would have a different message that they absorbed. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then there's also a healing message. So,
ooh,
yeah.
Okay, cool. So we'll put that in the show notes along with your typing guide so that people, if they're still just like, I feel like all of them, which is so common, right? So if people are still like, I still don't know, that's so normal. And you can, is it something they read through the typing guide?
Yep.
Perfect. So you can read through Steph's typing guide and figure it out more. And her Instagram is so helpful. It's like a wormhole. I'm always just like scrolling and scrolling. So, but okay, before we hop off, are you ready for rapid fire?
Sure. Let's do it.
What is your guilty or late night guilty pleasure snack?
Oh my gosh. Okay. I love cookies and I love baking cookies. And during the pandemic, I started making tahini dark chocolate chip cookies. It's a recipe from the New York Times and they're so freaking good. They're like the best. So I always have the cookie dough in my freezer and just pop a couple out of the freezer and putting them in the oven and I have fresh baked cookies.
That is genius. My
husband is a lucky man.
Yeah, really. I
am also very lucky to eat my own cookies.
Yeah, seriously. I know I always bake cookies and I'm like, it makes you look so nice, but it's like, this is for me.
This is very self-serving. Yeah.
Yeah. Who is your entrepreneurial girl crush?
Ooh. Okay. I think I have two. So one is Rachel Roberts, who she has a new book coming out called We Should All Be Millionaires.
Ooh.
And so I'm really excited to read that. And I love her podcast. It's really great. I just love, she's a type 8 and I love her energy and just the way that she does her business in her life. Like it's inspiring for me. Like I want more of that type 8 energy in my life.
Yeah.
And then my other is Amy Porterfield. I really like her podcast as well. And I just appreciate the way that she goes about doing her business because she's so like, she's so freaking helpful. Like, I love that. Like people always say I give up too much information for free. And I feel the same about Amy Porterfield. So maybe that's why she's my crush too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that. I just heard an amazing episode on her podcast with Jam Gamble. So good.
Oh my gosh.
It's
okay, I'll have to go listen to that one.
That girl, that woman runs Slay the Mic. And it was a really good episode. So little plug for that. Okay. And then do you use oils or no? Essential oils?
Sometimes I used to, but then I got out of them. Yeah.
Okay. It's okay. Well, sometimes we ask for blends that you love, but we'll just skip that question.
I used to have one. Wait, what was it?
Oh, perfect.
I think I need to get my oils out again. So for a while I did a blend that was, I think it was like lavender, citrus fresh, and geranium.
Ooh, yeah, that would be good.
Yeah. I had a friend who had that going at her house when I was there. And I was like, what is that scent? And I used to use oils more and I would like put way too many drops in and then it would be way too strong and it would smell terrible. And so then once I was like, oh, I just put one drop of these in, then I liked it. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I have a ton of oils that are like vetiver and like Palo Santo and like those woody oils. I really like those. Yeah.
Yeah. So good. We have at Whimsy Wellness, we have an Enneagram like collection that.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. They're so cool. We have like, you get your core roller bottle for your type. And then you also get like the number that you go to in stress and in growth. which we didn't get to talk about today, but it's like super easy to find. But yeah. And last, where can people find you and learn along with you and all of that fun stuff?
Yeah. So you can head to my website, which is untypes.co. And that's kind of the hub where you'll find everything. You can go to my blog and read blog posts. You can click on Find Your Type and get my typing resources. You can take my course, which is called From Frustrated to Flourishing. And it's about using a different look at the Enneagram to actually apply some growth knowledge. And then you can also go to my Instagram, which is at 9typesco.
Yes. I love your Instagram so much. It's amazing. I have so many saved 9typesco posts. Like I just have a whole Enneagram folder and I just save them all.
I love it.
Well, thank you so much. I feel like I've learned so much. I hope that listeners have learned a lot about the Enneagram. Just really appreciate you coming on.
Of course. Thanks so much for having me.
Of course.